Beth Carter's life had shrunk into a small, predictable routine. Every morning she would wake before sunrise, slipping quietly out of bed in her modest apartment on the outskirts of Nashville. The apartment was stark, a contrast to the vibrancy that once filled her life. Her guitar, now gathering dust in the corner, was the only reminder of the dreams she used to chase. She hadn't touched it in years. Beth worked as a waitress at Millie's Cafe, a cozy but unremarkable diner just a few blocks away. She liked the quietness of the early morning shift. The clinking of coffee cups and the hum of the kitchen became a kind of soundtrack to the life she had settled into. The customers came and went, most of them regulars who never asked much of her, which was exactly how she preferred it. But there was an undercurrent of loss that lingered in Beth's heart. At 35, her youthful ambitions of becoming a professional musician seemed like someone else's dreams, like a ghost she used to know. She had once been on the brink of something bigger. Her band had been good, really good. There were gigs, small tours, even a chance to sign with a label. But everything crumbled the moment Daniel Blake entered her life, a charismatic bandmate whose betrayal still haunted her every time she heard his name. Now, years later, Beth carried the weight of that failure, the weight of never quite making it. It was heavy, but she had grown used to the burden, just as she had grown used to the fading memories of her music. The passion that had once burned so fiercely inside her was now just a dim flicker, replaced by the steady rhythm of serving coffee, wiping tables, and watching life pass her by. Beth, table three's waiting, called Millie, the cafe's owner, from the back kitchen. The sharp voice snapped Beth out of her thoughts. "Got it," she replied, her smile forced but polite as she moved to deliver a plate of pancakes to a customer. Beth lived in quiet resignation, knowing that the life she once dreamed of was over. But that didn't mean she had stopped dreaming entirely. There was a part of her, however small, that still longed for something more. A part of her that still believed the music could return, but she silenced it, just like she silenced the urge to pick up the guitar at home. Little did Beth know, her past was about to walk through the doors of Millie's Cafe. It was just another slow afternoon at Millie's Cafe. The late autumn sun filtered through the dusty windows, casting long shadows across the wooden floor. Beth had wiped down the same counter for the third time in the last hour, her thoughts drifting once again to the past. She barely noticed when the bell over the door jingled, signaling the arrival of a new customer. "Afternoon," she muttered, without even looking up. Her fingers continued their rhythmic motion over the counter as if on autopilot. "Coffee, black," came a voice. Deep, confident. Beth paused, her hand freezing mid-wipe. Something about that voice tugged at the back of her mind. She glanced up, and for a moment, the world seemed to tilt on its axis. Standing there, impeccably dressed in a tailored coat and scarf, was a man she recognized instantly. Julian Parker. Julian Parker wasn't just anyone. He was one of the most renowned music producers in the industry, the kind of man who could make or break careers with a single phone call. The kind of man who had once been an untouchable figure in the world Beth had desperately tried to break into. And here he was, in her cafe, looking impossibly out of place among the cracked linoleum and the smell of burnt coffee. "Coming right up," she managed to say, her voice a little shaky. She turned to pour the coffee, her mind racing. What the hell is he doing here? Julian Parker had a reputation. He was ruthless in the business, known for spotting raw talent and turning it into gold. But just as often, he was known for discarding those who didn't meet his impossibly high standards. Beth knew about him. She had heard enough stories back when she was still playing gigs with her old band, but she never thought she'd see him in person, let alone serve him coffee. "Busy day?" Julian asked, his eyes scanning the cafe casually as she set the cup down in front of him. Beth nodded, forcing a smile. You could say that. As she turned to leave, she overheard part of his phone conversation. "Yeah, I'm meeting with Blake tomorrow. Finalizing the deal." The name hit her like a punch to the gut. Asterisk Blake? Daniel Blake? Asterisk she nearly dropped the coffee pot. The memories rushed back like a flood. The late nights, the rehearsals, the betrayal that had shattered not only her band but her life. She stood frozen, gripping the counter as Julian continued his conversation, oblivious to the storm raging inside her. He hung up, taking a sip of his coffee, but Beth couldn't focus on anything except the name that kept echoing in her head. Daniel Blake. The man who had destroyed her dreams, her career, and her trust. The man she had once been in a band with. The man who had promised everything and delivered nothing but ruin. And now, Julian Parker, this powerful producer, was about to sign a deal with him? Beth's heart pounded in her chest. She had to say something. But what? Could she really just walk up to a man like Julian Parker and warn him about Daniel? Would he even believe her? Her hands trembled as she walked back to the counter, wiping it down for the 100th time, her mind spinning. She had spent years trying to bury the pain of what happened, trying to move on. But now, it felt like the past was clawing its way back, refusing to let her go. She couldn't let this happen. She couldn't let Julian fall into Daniel's trap, just like she had. Her throat was dry, her stomach a knot of nerves, but she knew she had to do something. Beth glanced over at Julian, who was now casually scrolling through his phone. She took a deep breath, her pulse racing, and walked over to him, her voice barely steady. "Excuse me, Mr. Parker," she said, forcing herself to look him in the eye. Julian raised an eyebrow, surprised that the quiet waitress had spoken up. "Yes," he replied, his tone polite but guarded. Beth swallowed hard, her heart pounding. "About Daniel Blake. You need to be careful with him." Julian's expression changed. The polite smile faded, replaced by a curious, cautious look. "What do you mean?" Beth hesitated, but she couldn't stop now. I knew him. We were in a band together, years ago. He's not who you think he is." For a long moment, Julian stared at her, as if trying to size her up. The weight of the silence was suffocating. Then, he leaned back in his chair, his eyes narrowing slightly. "You were in a band with Daniel Blake?" he asked, his voice even, but laced with skepticism. Beth nodded, trying to keep her voice steady. "Yes, and I'm telling you, he's dangerous. He'll do anything to get what he wants, no matter who he hurts." Julian didn't say anything for what felt like an eternity. He took another slow sip of his coffee, watching her carefully over the rim of the cup. Beth's palms were slick with sweat, her heart hammering in her chest. She had no idea if he would believe her, or if she'd just made a huge mistake by speaking up. Finally, he set the cup down and looked her square in the eyes. "Interesting," Julian said, his voice unreadable. "Tell me more." Beth could feel her heart racing as Julian's eyes locked onto hers. She had expected him to brush her off, to dismiss her warning as the ramblings of a waitress who knew nothing about his world. But his calm, almost unnerving interest in her words caught her off guard. Her throat was dry, and she could barely swallow. Still, she knew this moment was pivotal. She couldn't back down now. Julian leaned forward, his elbows resting on the table, his fingers laced together. "So, you knew Daniel Blake. You played in a band together. And now, you're here, serving coffee," he said, his voice low but sharp, as if testing the waters of her story. Beth flinched at the last comment, but forced herself to keep steady. "Yes, we were in a band. We had some success. Small tours, local recognition. But it all fell apart because of him." She paused, her fingers nervously tugging at the apron she wore. "He isn't who you think he is, Mr. Parker. Daniel. He'll manipulate you, use you, and leave you in ruins." Julian tilted his head slightly, his expression still unreadable. "You're talking about someone who's about to sign one of the biggest contracts of the year. Do you really expect me to believe that he's, what, a con artist?" Beth pressed her lips together. She had anticipated this reaction. "It's more complicated than that. He's smart, charming, even. But Daniel doesn't care who he destroys to get what he wants. He did it to me, to our band, to everyone who trusted him." The tension between them grew thicker, and Beth could feel it settling around her like a heavy blanket. Julian's eyes studied her closely, not missing a single movement. His gaze was intense, assessing, as though he were dissecting her words piece by piece. "Beth, right?" he asked, glancing at her name tag. She nodded, feeling the weight of her name spoken by someone like Julian Parker. He sighed, leaning back in his chair, tapping his fingers against the table. "Tell me," he said, his voice quieter now. "What exactly happened between you and Daniel Blake? If you expect me to take you seriously, I need to know everything." Beth inhaled sharply, the memories rushing back. She hadn't spoken about this in years, not to anyone. She had buried it deep, hoping time would dull the pain. But now, faced with Julian's demand, she realized she couldn't hide anymore. If she didn't speak now, Daniel would win again, and someone else would fall victim to his deceit. We were in a band together. Me, Daniel, and two others, Nick and Sarah. It wasn't huge, but we were good enough that people started to notice. We had a few small offers, a demo that was getting attention. We even had a shot at something bigger, until Daniel made it about him. Julian raised an eyebrow, but didn't interrupt. He just listened, letting her continue. "Daniel, he's the kind of person who can talk his way into anything, and he did. He charmed investors, labels, anyone with power. He convinced them he was the reason for the band's success, that he was the genius behind it all. Slowly, he started pushing me and the others to the sidelines. I was the lead guitarist, but suddenly, Daniel's decisions were taking over. Our songs changed, our image changed. It was all about what he wanted." Beth paused, swallowing hard. And then came the final blow. Daniel got us a meeting with a label, a big one. We thought this was our moment. But when we showed up to the meeting, it was just Daniel sitting across from the execs. He had rewritten the deal, cutting us out entirely. He presented himself as a solo artist, leaving the rest of us with nothing. Our contract was gone before we could even fight for it. Julian's gaze darkened slightly. He was listening closely now, his curiosity shifting to something closer to concern. We tried to stand up to him, but it was too late. Daniel had already poisoned the waters. Nick spiraled into depression after that, and Sarah quit music altogether. As for me, I just couldn't handle the betrayal. I walked away. From everything. Beth's voice wavered, and she could feel the old hurt rising to the surface. Julian's eyes narrowed. "And you're telling me this because you think he'll do the same to me?" Beth nodded, her voice firmer now. "Yes. I don't know what his plan is this time, but I know he's dangerous. I'm warning you because you deserve to know before it's too late." Julian stayed quiet for a moment, his fingers tapping the side of his coffee cup. The cafe felt too small now, too quiet, with just the faint hum of the refrigerator filling the silence between them. Beth's heart thudded in her chest as she waited for his response. Finally, Julian spoke. "You're asking me to take a lot on faith here, Beth. You say Daniel ruined your career, and maybe that's true. But do you really think I'm the kind of person who can be easily manipulated?" Beth stared at him, unsure of how to respond. There was something in his tone, an edge of arrogance, maybe, or just confidence in his own ability to handle people like Daniel. But she had seen what Daniel could do. She had felt the destruction firsthand. "I'm not saying you're easy to manipulate, Mr. Parker," she said, choosing her words carefully. "But Daniel is convincing. He's made a career out of getting people to trust him. And by the time they realize the truth, it's too late." Julian studied her for another long moment before he stood up, his chair scraping against the floor. He pulled a business card from his pocket and placed it on the table between them. "I appreciate your honesty, Beth, but I'll be the judge of Daniel Blake's character. If you ever feel like sharing more, or if you have anything concrete, give me a call." Beth stared at the card, a knot tightening in her stomach. It was clear that Julian wasn't convinced. Maybe he was too smart, too powerful to believe that someone like Daniel could get the better of him. But Beth knew better. She knew what Daniel was capable of, and she feared that if Julian didn't listen, he would be the next to fall. As Julian walked out of the cafe, the bell over the door ringing in his wake, Beth's mind raced. She hadn't been able to stop Daniel before, but maybe this time she could. She had to. Beth awoke the next morning to the sound of heavy rain pattering against the window. She stared at the ceiling, feeling the weight of yesterday's encounter with Julian Parker. The memory of their conversation left a bitter taste in her mouth, as if her warning had evaporated the moment he left the cafe. She hadn't expected him to believe her right away, but his calm dismissal had unsettled her. She could only hope that he would take a second to reconsider before signing anything with Daniel Blake. Shaking off the remnants of a restless night, Beth swung her legs over the side of the bed and padded across the cold wooden floor. Her routine was unchanged. Get up, shower, head to work at Millie's cafe. Life moved in straight lines these days, predictable and repetitive. But as she walked down the stairs of her small apartment building, something felt off, like a tension brewing in the air beyond the rain. The walk to the cafe was quiet, except for the steady drumming of raindrops on her umbrella. The world was drenched in gray, and the streets were mostly empty. Beth liked it that way. It gave her time to think, to mentally prepare for the long day ahead. By the time she reached Millie's, the cafe was just waking up, with Millie herself setting up the tables and chairs. "Morning, Beth," Millie called from behind the counter as Beth hung her umbrella on the rack by the door. "Morning," Beth replied, though her voice was thick with exhaustion. She busied herself with setting up the coffee station, hoping to push thoughts of Julian and Daniel to the back of her mind. But that hope was shattered later that afternoon when a sleek, black car pulled up outside the cafe. Beth was wiping down a table near the window when she noticed the unfamiliar vehicle, its dark windows gleaming under the cloudy sky. The car idled there for a moment, then the driver's side door opened. A man stepped out, dressed in a sharp suit, his hair slicked back despite the rain. Beth's breath caught in her throat when she recognized him. Julian Parker. He stood beside the car for a moment, scanning the street before walking around to the passenger side and opening the door. Another figure emerged, this one more familiar and yet infinitely more troubling. Daniel Blake. Beth felt her stomach turn as she watched him step out of the car, his presence as unnerving as it had always been. He looked different now, older, certainly, but still exuding that same effortless charm, the same magnetic confidence that had drawn her in all those years ago. He smiled at Julian, saying something that made him laugh, and the sight of it made Beth's blood run cold. They started walking toward the cafe, and Beth's heart began to pound in her chest. She wasn't ready for this. She hadn't seen Daniel since the day he had betrayed her and the rest of the band, since the day he had signed that contract without them, leaving them in the dust, and now he was here, waltzing back into her life as if nothing had happened. "Beth," Millie's voice broke through her daze. "You okay?" Beth blinked, her grip tightening around the cloth in her hand. "Yeah, I'm fine," she lied, her eyes darting back to the door as Julian and Daniel entered the cafe. The bell above the door jingled, and both men walked in as if they owned the place. Julian spotted her first, his eyes locking on hers. For a brief moment, Beth saw something flicker across his face. Recognition, maybe even a hint of uncertainty. But Daniel didn't notice her at first. He was too busy scanning the cafe, his eyes drifting lazily over the decor, the customers, everything but her. Beth stood frozen behind the counter, unsure of what to do. She had imagined confronting Daniel 1,000 times in her mind, but now that he was standing just a few feet away, her anger and hurt were tangled up with fear. Memories rushed back, flashing like a slideshow. Late-night rehearsals, laughter over shared drinks, then the slow unraveling of trust until there was nothing left. "Beth," Julian said, his voice cutting through the tension like a blade. Daniel's head snapped in her direction, his eyes widening in recognition. For a moment, he looked surprised, but then his expression softened into something sickeningly familiar. A charming smile that Beth had once found disarming but now only filled her with disgust. Well, Daniel said, taking a step toward her. "Beth Carter. Long time no see." Beth swallowed, trying to keep her voice steady. "What are you doing here, Daniel?" He raised an eyebrow, feigning innocence. "I'm here with Julian. Business. You know how it is." Julian stood quietly beside him, his gaze flicking between them, clearly trying to gauge the situation. Beth could tell he hadn't expected this kind of reunion, and it unsettled him. "I told you yesterday, Julian," Beth said, her voice firmer now. "Daniel can't be trusted." Daniel chuckled, stepping closer to the counter, his hands raised as if in surrender. "Come on, Beth. You don't really still believe that, do you? It's been years. Ancient history. We were young, made some mistakes. No need to hold on to grudges, right?" Beth felt a surge of anger flare up in her chest. His casual dismissal of everything he had done was infuriating. She clenched her fists at her sides, but before she could speak, Julian stepped forward. "Beth warned me about you, Daniel," Julian said, his tone calm but edged with suspicion. "She told me what happened between you and the band." Daniel's smile faltered for a split second before he regained his composure. "Look, I don't know what she told you, but it's not the full story. Beth's talented, no question, but things didn't go the way any of us planned. It wasn't personal, just business. You know how it goes. Business?" Beth snapped, her voice rising. "You destroyed everything, Daniel. You lied, manipulated everyone, and left us with nothing. And now you're here, pretending like none of it mattered?" Julian watched them closely, his face unreadable, but Beth could sense the tension building beneath his composed exterior. He was weighing her words against Daniel's smooth explanations, and the decision he made next could change everything. "Beth," Daniel said, his voice softer now, almost condescending. "I get it. I do. But you need to let this go. We've all moved on. I've got a new project now, and Julian's smart enough to see the potential. I'm offering him something big, something you couldn't understand." Beth's hands trembled with frustration. She could see the manipulation at work, the way Daniel wove his words to make it seem like she was stuck in the past, like she was the one with the problem. But she wasn't the same naive girl she had been back then. "You're right, Daniel," she said, her voice steadying. "I have moved on, but you haven't changed. And if Julian's smart, he'll see that too." For a moment, no one spoke. The rain outside continued to beat against the windows, the cafe unnervingly still in the aftermath of Beth's words. Julian looked between them, his mind clearly processing everything. Daniel, on the other hand, remained still, his smile fading, replaced by a cold, calculating look that sent a chill down Beth's spine. "Julian," Daniel finally said, his voice tight. "We should go." Julian nodded, but before he followed Daniel to the door, he glanced back at Beth, his eyes lingering on her for a moment longer than necessary. "Maybe I will give you a call," he said quietly before turning and walking out into the rain. Beth stood there, her heart racing, unsure if she had made a difference or only stirred up old ghosts. But one thing was clear, this wasn't over. Not by a long shot. That night, Beth couldn't sleep. The encounter with Daniel and Julian played on a loop in her mind, the words exchanged echoing in the quiet of her small apartment. The weight of the past, the lies, the betrayal. It all felt too close, as though the years between then and now had evaporated. She tossed and turned, the memories clawing at her like they always did when she let her guard down. By morning, Beth had made up her mind. She wasn't going to let Daniel manipulate Julian, or anyone else, the way he had manipulated her. She had stayed quiet for too long, letting the past control her, and now, it was time to confront it head-on. When she arrived at Millie's cafe that day, the usual routine of wiping down tables and pouring coffee felt like background noise to the tension that was building inside her. The cafe was nearly empty, a quiet Tuesday, with just a few regulars sitting at their usual spots. But Beth couldn't focus. Her mind was already elsewhere, replaying the events of the previous day. Julian had left with Daniel, but the look in his eyes before he walked out. There had been doubt there, hadn't there? A hesitation? As if summoned by her thoughts, the familiar sound of the cafe door opening pulled her from her reverie. Her heart skipped a beat when she saw the figure standing in the doorway. Julian Parker. He looked different from the previous day, less put together, perhaps. His sharp, tailored suit was gone, replaced with something more casual, and there was an air of weariness about him. He didn't scan the cafe this time. Instead, his eyes found Beth immediately. Beth set down the coffee pot she had been holding and wiped her hands on her apron. She wasn't sure what to expect. Yesterday, Julian had seemed unsure, torn between her warnings and Daniel's smooth-talking charm. Today, he looked like a man searching for answers. "Beth," Julian greeted as he approached the counter, his voice low, but not unkind. "Do you have a minute?" Beth nodded, her heart thudding in her chest. She motioned toward an empty table near the back, and the two of them sat down, away from the prying ears of the few customers lingering over their coffee. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Julian seemed to be collecting his thoughts, his hands resting on the table, his fingers drumming softly. Beth could feel the tension, the anticipation hanging in the air. "I did some digging after we spoke," Julian finally said, breaking the silence. His eyes were fixed on hers, sharp but weary. "About Daniel." Beth's breath caught in her throat. She had hoped he would, but hearing the words made it real. She waited, not wanting to interrupt. Julian leaned back in his chair, crossing his arms. It didn't take much to find some inconsistencies, old contracts, deals that fell through, people who were suddenly out of work when Daniel came into the picture. His voice hardened as he spoke. "It's a pattern." Beth nodded, her fingers tightening around the edge of the table. "That's how he works. He convinces you he's your ally, then takes everything for himself. By the time you realize what's happening, it's already too late." Julian sighed, rubbing his temples. "I should have seen it sooner. But Daniel, he's good at this. He knows how to play people." Beth's chest tightened. The relief of being believed was palpable, but it also brought with it a fresh wave of anger. Daniel had never been held accountable for what he had done. He had walked away from their band, from the wreckage he caused, without so much as a backward glance. And now, he was trying to do it again, on a much larger scale. "There's more," Julian said, his voice quieter now, more cautious. He hesitated for a moment, as if weighing whether to say the next part. "While I was looking into Daniel, I found something that involved me, too." Beth frowned, leaning in slightly. "What do you mean?" Julian's jaw clenched. "It turns out my family had dealings with Daniel years ago. My father, specifically." He shook his head, as if still trying to make sense of it. "Daniel wasn't just some bandmate you lost touch with. He's been in the background of my life, manipulating things for years." Beth's eyes widened. She hadn't expected this. Julian's family? What kind of connection could they have had with Daniel? "I don't know all the details yet," Julian continued, his voice low. "But from what I've pieced together, my father was involved in some business deals with Daniel, ones that went bad. But instead of cutting ties, my father kept quiet about it. Covered for him, even." The revelation sent a chill down Beth's spine. Daniel's betrayal hadn't been some one-off incident. It was part of a much larger, more insidious game, one that had spanned years, maybe even decades. Beth's mind raced. If Daniel had connections to Julian's family, that meant he had been planning this for far longer than anyone realized. It wasn't just about a business deal or a music contract. It was about control, power, manipulation on a scale Beth hadn't even considered. "I knew Daniel was dangerous," Beth said, her voice barely above a whisper. "But this is bigger than I thought." Julian nodded, his face grim. "It's not just about me or you anymore. Daniel's been playing a long game, and we're just now starting to see the pieces." For a long moment, they sat in silence, the weight of the revelation settling between them like a dark cloud. Beth's mind was spinning with questions, each more unsettling than the last. How much had Daniel orchestrated? How many lives had he affected without them even knowing? Julian broke the silence, his tone resolute. "I'm going to confront him. I need to know the truth. All of it." Beth felt a jolt of fear at the thought. Daniel wasn't the kind of person you simply confronted. He was slippery, dangerous, a master at twisting situations to his advantage. "Julian," Beth said, her voice steady but laced with concern, "be careful. He's not going to just admit what he's done. He'll lie. He'll manipulate. He'll make you think you're the one who's wrong." Julian looked at her, his eyes hard but determined. "I know, but I can't just walk away from this. Not now. Not after everything I've found." Beth wanted to warn him, to make him understand how dangerous Daniel truly was. But she could see it in Julian's face, the same look she had seen in the mirror all those years ago. The need for answers. The need to confront the person who had torn everything apart. "You're not alone in this," Beth said, surprising herself with the intensity of her words. "I'll help you, whatever it takes." Julian looked at her, something like gratitude flickering in his eyes. "Thank you, Beth. I think we're going to need all the help we can get." As they stood to leave, the storm outside had intensified, rain pelting against the windows with renewed fury. Beth felt it too, the storm brewing inside her, the one that had been waiting for this moment for years. This was just the beginning. The truth about Daniel Blake was unraveling, and for the first time, Beth felt like she was no longer running from the past. She was running toward it, ready to face whatever came next. The reckoning had begun. The air outside Millie's cafe was thick with the promise of rain as Beth and Julian stepped out into the gray afternoon. The clouds overhead churned, dark and foreboding, much like the storm that had just begun to stir between them and Daniel Blake. Beth could feel it, the weight of everything they had uncovered, pressing down on her like a stone on her chest. But it wasn't just the past anymore. It was the present, and somehow, Daniel was more entwined in their lives than either of them had realized. "Where are we going?" Beth asked as they made their way down the slick street. Julian had been quiet since they left the cafe, his brow furrowed, deep in thought. "My office," Julian said, his voice clipped. "There's something I need to show you." Beth didn't ask more. She could sense that whatever he had discovered, it was big. Maybe even bigger than the connection between Daniel and his father. The thought sent a shiver through her. She had always known Daniel was ruthless, but this, it felt more like a conspiracy than just a personal betrayal. And now, Julian was caught in the middle of it, just like she had been. They arrived at a sleek office building downtown, its mirrored glass windows reflecting the storm clouds above. Inside, the sterile brightness of the lobby was a stark contrast to the heavy gloom outside. Julian led Beth past the reception desk, up to his private office on the top floor. The room was spacious, modern, with floor-to-ceiling windows that offered a sweeping view of the city. But Beth barely noticed. Her eyes were fixed on Julian as he moved toward his desk, pulling out a folder with a series of documents. "I spent all night going through these," Julian said, dropping the folder onto the desk with a heavy thud. "There are old contracts, records of business dealings, and correspondence between my father and Daniel. But this," he pulled out a faded photograph from the folder, handing it to Beth. "This is what changed everything." Beth stared down at the photograph, her breath catching in her throat. It was an old picture, grainy and weathered with time, but unmistakable. The image showed a younger Julian, no more than a boy of 10 or 11, standing beside his father. And next to them, smiling with that same practiced charm, was Daniel Blake. Her mind raced, trying to make sense of it. How is this possible? "You knew Daniel back then?" Julian nodded grimly. "I didn't remember at first. He wasn't around much when I was a kid. But when I started looking through my father's old files, I found this. Daniel wasn't just some business partner. He was practically family. He and my father were working on deals together for years. Long before I even knew what the music business was, Beth felt a sinking sensation in the pit of her stomach. So, this isn't just about the band or the contracts. This goes back further, doesn't it?" "Much further," Julian said, his voice tight with frustration. "I went through everything I could find, and the more I looked, the more it became clear. Daniel's been pulling the strings for years. He's used my family's connections to prop himself up, to push his own career forward. And all this time, I had no idea." Beth ran a hand through her hair, the weight of the revelation nearly overwhelming. "What does he want from you now, Julian? If he's already used your family, what's his endgame?" Julian shook his head. "That's what I'm trying to figure out. My father covered for him, buried the evidence of deals gone wrong, smoothed things over when Daniel screwed up. But my father died a few years ago, and since then, Daniel hasn't had anyone protecting him. I think he's trying to use me now, to keep himself afloat." Beth's heart pounded in her chest. The stakes had just become much higher than she'd realized. This wasn't just about the band anymore, or even Julian's business deals. Daniel was weaving a web of deceit that spanned decades, and now they were caught in the middle of it. "Do you think he's trying to blackmail you?" Beth asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Is that why he's working with you now? To get control of whatever your father left behind?" Julian's jaw clenched. "It wouldn't surprise me. There are documents in here that mention a partnership agreement my father had with Daniel. Something about future investments in the music industry. It's vague, but I get the feeling Daniel's been holding onto this for leverage. If he can get me to sign over certain assets or agree to this deal with him, he'll have control over my father's legacy, and mine." Beth stared at the papers strewn across the desk, her mind racing. Daniel had always been calculating, always one step ahead. But this was different. This wasn't just about using people to advance his career. This was about control over people's lives, their futures. "We can't let him get away with this," Beth said, her voice steady but filled with determination. "He's destroyed too many lives already. We need to stop him before he does any more damage." Julian looked at her, a flicker of something like gratitude in his eyes. "I don't plan on letting him win, but we need proof. Something concrete that ties him to all of this." Beth nodded, her mind already working through the possibilities. "If there are more documents, more evidence buried in those old files, we need to find them. There has to be something that links him to the deals he's made, the people he's hurt." Julian's gaze sharpened. "There's one more thing." He pulled out a small, battered notebook from the bottom of the folder and handed it to Beth. "I found this among my father's belongings. It's his personal journal. It mentions Daniel a few times, but there's one entry in particular that stands out." Beth opened the journal carefully, flipping through the yellowed pages until she reached the entry Julian had marked. The handwriting was shaky, as though written in haste, and the words sent a chill down her spine. "Daniel's plan is more dangerous than I realized. If he follows through, it could destroy everything. I need to put an end to this, but I'm not sure how much time I have left." Beth stared at the words, the full weight of the situation settling over her. "Your father knew," she whispered. "He knew what Daniel was planning, and he was trying to stop him." Julian nodded, his expression grim. "But he never got the chance. He died shortly after writing that entry. And now, Daniel's picking up where he left off." Beth closed the journal, her pulse racing. The pieces were starting to come together, but the picture they painted was far darker than she had imagined. Daniel's reach extended further than they had known, and now they were running out of time to stop him. "What do we do now?" Beth asked, her voice steady despite the fear gnawing at her. Julian's eyes hardened with resolve. "We find the rest of the evidence, and then we confront Daniel with the truth." Beth nodded, her jaw set in determination. They had been caught in Daniel's web for too long, but now, with the truth on their side, they had a chance to finally break free. The storm outside rumbled as if echoing the battle to come, and Beth knew that whatever happened next, they couldn't afford to lose. The rain had turned into a relentless downpour by the time Beth and Julian left his office. Thunder rolled in the distance, echoing the storm brewing between them and Daniel Blake. Beth felt the tension prickling at her skin, a feeling that had grown stronger with each revelation, with every new piece of the puzzle they uncovered. As they drove through the rain-soaked streets, Beth couldn't shake the feeling that they were hurtling towards something inevitable. And it wasn't just about stopping Daniel, it was about survival. Julian drove in silence, his hands gripping the steering wheel tightly, his knuckles white against the black leather. Beth could see the weight of everything they had discovered etched on his face, his mind clearly racing through the implications of Daniel's manipulations. "We're close now," Julian muttered, more to himself than to Beth. "If we can find the final piece of evidence, we'll have everything we need." Beth nodded, though her mind was still trying to piece together all the connections. Daniel had always been manipulative, but the scope of his deceit was staggering. He had woven himself into the very fabric of Julian's life, exploiting his father's legacy, his family's business, all for his own gain. And somehow, Daniel had managed to stay hidden, his true intentions masked behind years of charm and charisma. As they neared the outskirts of the city, Julian finally spoke again, his voice tight with determination. "We're meeting someone who used to work with my father. He might have the missing documents, something that ties Daniel directly to the deals. He was my father's closest advisor before everything fell apart." Beth's pulse quickened. This was it, the final step before they could confront Daniel. If they had the evidence, they could expose him for who he truly was, once and for all. But there was a part of her that feared what might happen next. Daniel wasn't the type to go down without a fight. He was cunning, ruthless, and dangerous. And if he knew they were closing in on him, there was no telling what he might do. They pulled up to a small, secluded house just outside of town, hidden behind a cluster of tall trees. The rain had eased into a soft drizzle, the air heavy with moisture and the scent of wet earth. Julian parked the car, and they both sat for a moment, staring at the darkened windows of the house. "His name is Charles Weber," Julian said quietly. "He left the business after my father died. He didn't trust Daniel. I think he knew more than he ever let on." Beth glanced at Julian, her stomach churning with nerves. "Do you think he'll talk to us?" Julian exhaled slowly, his gaze fixed on the house. "We don't have a choice. We need him." With a deep breath, they stepped out into the damp evening, the air thick with the smell of rain and decaying leaves. The path leading to the house was narrow and overgrown, as though no one had walked it in years. Beth felt a sense of unease wash over her as they approached the front door. Julian knocked, the sound echoing in the stillness. For a long moment, there was no response. Then, just as Beth was about to suggest they leave, the door creaked open, revealing an older man with deep-set eyes and a weary expression. His graying hair was disheveled, and his clothes were wrinkled, as though he hadn't slept in days. "Julian," the man said, his voice raspy. "I didn't think I'd ever see you again." Julian offered a tight smile. "Charles, we need your help." Charles glanced at Beth, his gaze wary, before stepping aside to let them in. The inside of the house was cluttered, papers and old documents piled on every available surface, as though Charles had been living among the remnants of his past. The air was thick with dust, and the dim light from a single lamp cast long shadows across the room. "What's this about?" Charles asked, though his tone suggested he already knew. Julian wasted no time. "It's about my father, and Daniel Blake." Charles stiffened at the mention of Daniel's name, his eyes narrowing. He motioned for them to sit at a small table near the window, where the rain dripped steadily against the glass. Beth could feel the tension in the room, thick and heavy, as though something unsaid lingered just beneath the surface. "I always knew it would come to this," Charles said after a long silence. He sat down across from them, his hands trembling slightly as he reached for a stack of old papers on the table. "Your father." He wasn't blind to what Daniel was doing, but by the time he realized it, he was already in too deep. Daniel had him wrapped up in too many deals, too many promises that couldn't be broken without everything falling apart. Beth leaned forward, her voice urgent. "We need proof, something that ties Daniel to all of it. The contracts, the manipulations, anything we can use to stop him." Charles sighed, running a hand through his graying hair. "There's only one thing that might help you." He pulled a faded envelope from the stack of papers and handed it to Julian. "Your father gave me this before he died. He didn't want it getting out, but I think he knew it would be necessary one day." Julian took the envelope carefully, his hands trembling as he opened it. Inside were several documents, legal papers, contracts, and a handwritten letter from Julian's father. As Julian read the letter, his face paled, his eyes wide with shock. Beth's stomach twisted as she watched him, the silence in the room growing heavier with each passing second. "Julian?" Beth asked, her voice barely a whisper. "What is it?" Julian swallowed hard, his voice hollow. "It's worse than we thought." He handed the letter to Beth, and as her eyes scanned the words, she felt the ground shift beneath her. The letter was a confession written by Julian's father in the final days before his death. In it, he detailed how Daniel had blackmailed him, using information about the family's finances and shady business deals to gain control over their assets. But it didn't stop there. Daniel had threatened to expose secrets that could ruin the family, secrets that would destroy everything Julian's father had built. Beth's hands shook as she finished reading the letter. "He blackmailed your father, and now he's doing the same to you." Julian nodded, his jaw clenched. "He's been pulling the strings all along, using my father's mistakes to his advantage. And now he's trying to use me to cover his tracks." Charles looked down at the table, his expression grim. "I tried to warn your father, but he wouldn't listen. He thought he could handle Daniel, thought he could keep him in check. But Daniel's too dangerous. He's always 2 steps ahead." Beth felt a surge of anger rise in her chest. Daniel had ruined her life, and now he was doing the same to Julian, all for the sake of power and control. She had been a pawn in Daniel's game, and now Julian was too. "We can't let him get away with this," Beth said, her voice fierce. "We have the proof now. We can take him down." Julian's eyes darkened with determination. "We'll confront him. We'll make him pay for what he's done." But as the storm outside intensified, Beth couldn't shake the feeling that they were walking into something far more dangerous than they could have imagined. Daniel Blake wasn't going to go down easily, and they weren't just fighting for their futures anymore. They were fighting for their lives. The night was thick with tension as Beth and Julian made their way to the luxury hotel where Daniel Blake was staying. The rain had finally stopped, but the sky remained heavy with dark clouds, as if nature itself was holding its breath for the confrontation that was about to unfold. Beth could feel her pulse racing, her mind swimming with the gravity of what they were about to do. They had the documents now, the proof of Daniel's manipulation, the trail of deceit that tied him to Julian's family and countless others. But the danger hadn't disappeared. If anything, it felt more potent, lurking in the shadows like an invisible threat. The lobby of the hotel was gleaming with polished marble floors and chandeliers, a stark contrast to the stormy night outside. The opulence of it all felt surreal, almost like stepping into another world. Beth glanced at Julian as they walked in, his face set in hard lines of determination. He had barely said a word since they left Charles's house, but she could see the battle raging inside him, the need for justice, for closure, but also the weight of confronting someone who had been a part of his life for so long. Daniel wasn't just an enemy to him. He was a twisted part of Julian's past. As they approached the concierge, Julian spoke calmly, though his voice had a sharp edge to it. "We're here to see Daniel Blake. I believe he's expecting us." The concierge, a young woman with a practiced smile, tapped a few keys on her computer before nodding. "Mr. Blake is in the penthouse suite. He requested no interruptions, but I'll let him know you're here." Julian didn't wait for her to finish. "He'll see us." Beth followed him toward the elevators, her heart pounding as they stepped inside. The ride-up felt like an eternity, the silence between them thick with anticipation. Beth stared at the glowing numbers on the panel, each one taking them closer to Daniel, closer to a confrontation that could either free them from his grasp or trap them in something far worse. When the elevator doors slid open, they were greeted by the plush, sprawling hallway leading to Daniel's suite. The air was different up here, thicker, quieter, almost suffocating. At the end of the hall, a single door stood waiting. Julian walked ahead, his step steady, and Beth followed close behind, her nerves fraying with each step. Julian knocked twice. The sound echoed through the empty hall like a gunshot. For a moment, nothing happened. Beth's heart raced as she imagined Daniel on the other side, cool and calculating, preparing for whatever he had planned. Then, the door clicked open. Daniel stood in the doorway, his expression unreadable. He was dressed casually, but his demeanor was anything but. His eyes flicked between Julian and Beth, a slow smile spreading across his face. "Well, well," Daniel said, his voice smooth as ever. "I didn't expect a reunion so soon, but come in by all means." Beth felt a chill creep up her spine as they stepped inside. The penthouse was just as luxurious as the rest of the hotel, modern, sleek, and expensive, but there was something unsettling about it, as if the very walls held secrets. Daniel moved to the center of the room, his movements unhurried, controlled. It was clear he didn't feel threatened by their presence. He was confident, arrogant even, as though he believed he still had the upper hand. Julian wasted no time. He dropped the folder of documents on the coffee table with a heavy thud, the sound cutting through the quiet like a blade. "We know everything, Daniel," he said, his voice cold. "We know about the deals you made with my father, the blackmail, the manipulation. It's over." Daniel's smile didn't falter. He looked down at the folder, then back up at Julian, his eyes gleaming with amusement. "Is it? I'm curious, Julian. What exactly do you think you've uncovered? Business is complicated. After all, your father knew that better than anyone." Beth clenched her fists at her sides, the anger bubbling inside her. "This isn't business. This is blackmail, extortion, and manipulation. You used his family just like you used mine." Daniel's gaze shifted to Beth, his smile never wavering. "Ah, Beth. Always so passionate." I was wondering how long it would take for you to show up in all of this. Still holding on to those old grudges, I see. I thought you'd moved on by now. Beth felt the familiar sting of his words, the way he twisted the past to make her look like the bitter one, the one who couldn't let go. But she wasn't that person anymore. She had spent too many years living in the shadow of what Daniel had done to her, too many nights haunted by the betrayal. Now, she stood in front of him with the truth, and this time, she wasn't going to back down. You destroyed everything, she said, her voice steady despite the fury bubbling underneath. You took our band, our future, and twisted it for your own gain. You think you can do the same thing to Julian? To his father's legacy? We have the proof now, Daniel. You can't manipulate your way out of this. Daniel's eyes darkened, the mask of charm slipping just enough for Beth to catch a glimpse of the cold, calculating man beneath. He stepped closer, his voice lowering to a dangerous tone. You think you're going to take me down with a few old contracts and a letter? You don't know how this game works, Beth. You never did. Julian moved to stand beside her, his presence a quiet force of solidarity. This isn't a game anymore, Daniel. We're going to expose you. To the industry, to the media. Everyone will know who you really are. For the first time, Daniel's smile faltered. His eyes flicked between Beth and Julian, and for a split second, she saw it. The crack in his armor, the realization that they were serious, that the lies he had so carefully constructed were about to unravel. But just as quickly, he recovered, his expression hardening into something more dangerous. You have no idea what you're stepping into, Daniel said, his voice laced with venom. You think you can just walk away from this? That you can ruin me and get away unscathed? You're playing with fire, and I can promise you. People get burned. Beth felt the threat in his words, sharp and real, but she didn't flinch. She had come too far, fought too hard to back down now. She glanced at Julian, who met her gaze with the same determination. We're not afraid of you, Daniel, Julian said quietly but firmly. Not anymore. Daniel's eyes flashed with something dark, something dangerous, but he said nothing. The silence in the room was suffocating, the air thick with the weight of unspoken threats. Beth could feel her pulse in her throat, but she refused to look away. This was the moment they had been building toward, the moment where Daniel's lies were laid bare. Finally, Daniel took a step back, his expression cool but his eyes simmering with fury. You think you've won something here? He said, his voice soft but venomous. You have no idea what you've just started. Beth's heart raced as she and Julian turned to leave, the threat hanging in the air like a noose tightening around them. They had the evidence, but Daniel wasn't finished. And as they walked out of the penthouse, Beth knew this wasn't the end. It was just the beginning of a new, more dangerous battle. Outside, the storm clouds were breaking apart, and the city lights shimmered below them, but the darkness lingered. The city seemed unnaturally quiet as Beth and Julian stepped out of the hotel, the rain having left a slick sheen on the streets, reflecting the faint glow of streetlights. The confrontation with Daniel had gone as expected, but there was a lingering dread in the pit of Beth's stomach. She had seen the flash of fury in Daniel's eyes, the cold calculation behind his smile. They had rattled him, exposed him, but it was clear that he wasn't done with them yet. As they walked toward Julian's car, Beth felt her pulse slowly begin to settle, but her mind was far from at ease. Do you think he's going to come after us? She asked, her voice low, keeping pace with Julian. Julian didn't answer right away. His jaw was clenched, and his hands were stuffed into his pockets as though he was holding back the storm of emotions that had been brewing ever since they confronted Daniel. Finally, he spoke, his voice quiet but firm. Daniel isn't the type to let things go easily. But we've got the evidence now. If we move quickly, we can get ahead of whatever he's planning. Beth nodded, though her anxiety gnawed at her. She could still feel the weight of Daniel's words hanging over them, a thinly veiled threat that clung to the air. What's our next step? Julian unlocked the car and slid into the driver's seat, his expression hardening as he considered their options. We need to go public. The contracts, the letter from my father, everything. If we expose him now, before he has a chance to retaliate, he'll be forced to play defense. Beth hesitated, staring out the window as the city lights blurred past them. It was the right plan, the only plan, but she couldn't shake the feeling that they were walking into a trap. Daniel had always been 2 steps ahead, and even now, she feared he had something up his sleeve. "How long do we have?" Beth asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Julian glanced at her, his eyes dark with determination. "Not long. I have a contact in the press, someone I trust. I'll reach out to him tonight. If we can get the story out first thing tomorrow, Daniel won't have time to spin it. We need to control the narrative before he can." Beth nodded, though the tension in her chest refused to ease. She trusted Julian, but the stakes were higher than ever. One wrong move, and Daniel could destroy them both, professionally, personally. And Beth knew better than anyone just how far Daniel was willing to go to protect himself. As Julian drove them back to his office, the streets outside seemed to close in on them, dark and empty. The tension between them grew heavier, unspoken fears lingering in the silence. Beth stared out the window, lost in thought, her mind racing through everything that had led them to this moment. The memories of her time with Daniel, the band, the betrayal, felt like distant echoes now. But those wounds had never truly healed, and tonight, facing Daniel again, it felt as if those old scars had been ripped open. Julian's phone buzzed, pulling both of them out of their thoughts. He glanced at the screen and cursed under his breath. "It's my lawyer." Beth's heart skipped a beat. "What is it?" Julian hesitated before answering. "Daniel's already making moves. My lawyer's been contacted by his legal team. They're threatening to sue for defamation if we go public with any of this." Beth felt her stomach drop. "He's trying to silence us." Julian nodded, his grip tightening on the steering wheel. "He's not wasting any time." "But we knew this was coming." Beth's mind raced. This was exactly what she had feared. Daniel was moving faster than they had anticipated. If they didn't act soon, he would bury them in legal threats, drown them in litigation until they were too exhausted to fight back. "What do we do?" she asked, her voice edged with urgency. Julian took a deep breath, his jaw clenched. "We move forward. He's trying to scare us into backing down, but we can't let him. The moment we hesitate, he wins." Beth knew he was right, but the fear gnawed at her. Daniel had resources, connections, influence. He could bury them if he wanted to. But then again, he had underestimated them before. He hadn't expected them to uncover the truth, to push back against his carefully constructed lies. And now, for the first time, they had the upper hand. They reached Julian's office, a modern high-rise that loomed over the city. The lights of the building flickered against the dark sky as they entered, a stark contrast to the quiet tension simmering between them. Julian's office was on the top floor, spacious and filled with sleek furniture. The walls lined with gold records and framed photographs of famous artists he had worked with. It was a reminder of the life Julian had built, a life that Daniel was trying to rip apart. Julian sat behind his desk, pulling out the folder of documents they had retrieved from Charles earlier. He spread them across the desk, his eyes scanning the pages with a laser-like focus. "We need to organize this, get everything in order before we send it to the press. Once this story breaks, there's no turning back." Beth nodded, sitting across from him, her hands trembling slightly as she picked up one of the contracts. The evidence was all there. The contracts Daniel had manipulated, the letter from Julian's father detailing Daniel's blackmail and coercion, the emails that painted a picture of just how deep Daniel's control over the family business had gone. It was everything they needed to take him down. But even as Beth looked at the damning evidence in her hands, a cold sense of dread crept over her. Daniel wasn't the type to sit back and wait for the axe to fall. He would be preparing his next move, planning his next strike. And Beth feared they wouldn't see it coming until it was too late. "Beth." Julian's voice pulled her from her thoughts. He was staring at her, concern flickering in his eyes. "You okay?" She nodded quickly, though the unease in her chest hadn't subsided. "Yeah, I'm fine. This is all moving so fast." Julian leaned back in his chair, his gaze softening. "I know, but we're close. We just have to hold on a little longer." Beth wanted to believe him, but the nagging fear in the back of her mind wouldn't go away. Daniel wasn't going to go down without a fight. And the closer they got to the truth, the more dangerous he would become. The next morning, the city was alive with the usual buzz of traffic and people going about their daily routines. But for Beth, the day felt like it was standing still. Julian had spent the entire night coordinating with his contact in the press, making sure every detail of their story was airtight. The evidence they had uncovered was set to be released in an exclusive report, and by midday, Daniel's carefully constructed empire would be under siege. But as Beth sat in the corner of Julian's office, watching the minutes tick by, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The silence was too heavy, the air too still. Her phone buzzed on the desk, and she picked it up to see a message from an unknown number. "You're making a mistake." Her heart skipped a beat, and her stomach twisted into a knot. She stared at the message, her fingers tightening around the phone. She didn't need to guess who it was from. Daniel. Beth's chest tightened as she showed the message to Julian. His expression darkened, and he leaned forward, his voice low. "He's trying to rattle you." Beth swallowed hard, forcing herself to breathe. What if he knows something we don't? What if we're walking into a trap? Julian shook his head. "We've got him. He's running out of options. That message is a bluff. He's trying to scare you into backing down." Beth wanted to believe that, but the unease gnawed at her. Daniel wasn't the type to bluff. Every move he made was calculated, every threat carefully crafted. He had always been 2 steps ahead, and even now, Beth couldn't help but wonder if they were playing right into his hands. As the clock struck noon, Beth's phone buzzed again. This time, it wasn't from Daniel. It was an alert. An article had just gone live. The story they had worked so hard to piece together was out in the world for everyone to see. Beth and Julian exchanged a look, a mix of relief and fear settling between them. The truth was out. The fallout had begun. But even as the headlines began to spread, Beth's phone buzzed one more time. Another message, this one more ominous than the last. "You have no idea what you've started." Beth's breath caught in her throat. The message sent a chill down her spine, the words heavy with an unspoken threat. She looked at Julian, her voice barely a whisper. "We're not done yet." Within hours, the fallout from Julian's story began to spread, not just across the music industry, but into the world of finance and business. Daniel Blake's carefully constructed empire, the years of manipulation, blackmail, and exploitation, was unraveling at an alarming rate. News outlets picked up the story, with headlines flashing across social media, recounting every sordid detail. The contracts he had falsified, the coercion of Julian's father, the bands he had destroyed, the lives he had ruined. It was all laid bare for the world to see. For Beth, the initial relief was almost overwhelming. She had waited years for this moment, the moment Daniel's reign of deception would crumble, the moment she could finally breathe without the weight of the past pressing down on her. Sitting in the quiet corner of Julian's office, watching the headlines roll in, she should have felt victorious. But something about the final message from Daniel lingered in the back of her mind. "You have no idea what you've started." The words repeated over and over, gnawing at her as if they carried a deeper meaning, a darker promise. She had spent too long underestimating Daniel, and now, with everything laid out in the open, she feared that he wasn't simply going to disappear into the shadows. Julian was on the phone, his voice calm but firm as he navigated the sudden barrage of calls from lawyers, reporters, and industry contacts. He had spent the last 24 hours meticulously orchestrating the release of their story, and now it was out of their hands. All they could do was wait and see what happened next. "Are you okay?" Julian asked, setting down the phone and glancing at Beth. His eyes were soft, but there was a tension behind them, as if he, too, was waiting for the other shoe to drop. Beth nodded, though the tightness in her chest hadn't eased. "I should feel better about all this, shouldn't I? We did what we set out to do. We exposed him." Julian frowned, leaning back in his chair. "You're worried about that message, aren't you?" Beth swallowed hard, nodding again. "Daniel doesn't just make empty threats. If he says we've started something, I'm afraid he means it. What if this isn't over? What if he's planning something we don't see coming?" Julian leaned forward, his hands clasped together on the desk. He's losing control. His empire is collapsing, and he's desperate. That message was meant to scare you, Beth. He wants us to second-guess ourselves, to panic and make mistakes. Beth stared at the floor, her mind racing. But what if it's more than that? What if he's got something bigger planned? Something we didn't anticipate? Julian sighed, rubbing his temples. I don't know. I wish I could tell you he's finished, that this is the end of the line for him. But you're right. Daniel's not the kind of man who goes down quietly. We need to be prepared. Before Beth could respond, Julian's phone buzzed again, and his eyes flicked to the screen. His expression darkened immediately. It's my lawyer. Beth's heart lurched. She could tell from Julian's face that something wasn't right. He answered the call, his voice steady but tense. What's going on? There was a long silence as Julian listened, his jaw tightening with every passing second. Beth watched, her pulse quickening, knowing instinctively that something had gone wrong. When Julian finally spoke again, his voice was low and controlled. Okay, I'll handle it. He hung up, exhaling slowly before meeting Beth's eyes. Daniel's team is filing an injunction. They're trying to block the release of more documents, claiming defamation and breach of contract. Beth felt her stomach drop. Can they do that? Julian shook his head. They can try, but it's a stall tactic. He's trying to buy time. Beth's mind raced. Time for what? Julian's face darkened. I don't know, but whatever it is, we need to be ready. The following days were a blur of legal battles and media frenzy. Daniel's lawyers fought viciously to suppress the growing mountain of evidence against him, filing lawsuits and injunctions at every turn. But the damage was done. The truth had already spread like wildfire, and no amount of legal maneuvering could undo it. Interviews with other victims surfaced, former bandmates, business partners, even industry insiders who had been silenced by Daniel's influence. Each one added another layer to the portrait of a man whose entire career had been built on lies and exploitation. Beth spent her nights poring over the documents they had uncovered, searching for anything they might have missed, any hidden threat Daniel could still use against them. But the deeper she dug, the more it became clear that Daniel was running out of options. He had spent years building his empire on the backs of others, and now it was crumbling beneath him. Still, the unease lingered. Beth couldn't shake the feeling that Daniel wasn't done, that he had one last card to play. She had lived through his manipulations before, and she knew how dangerous he could be when cornered. It wasn't until the fourth day after the story broke that everything came to a head. Beth and Julian were in his office, reviewing the latest developments in the case, when Julian's assistant knocked on the door, her face pale. "There's someone here to see you," she said, her voice trembling slightly. Julian frowned, glancing at Beth before standing up. "Who is it?" The assistant hesitated. "It's Daniel Blake." Beth's heart stopped. The room seemed to close in around her, the air suddenly thick and suffocating. She hadn't seen Daniel since the night they confronted him in his hotel suite, and the idea of facing him again now, in the midst of everything, sent a chill down her spine. Julian's face hardened. "Send him in." Beth stood, her hands trembling slightly as the door opened and Daniel Blake walked into the room. He looked different from the last time they had seen him, disheveled, worn, with a faint sheen of desperation clinging to him like a second skin. But his eyes, those sharp, calculating eyes, were as dangerous as ever. Daniel didn't speak right away. He stood there, his hands in his pockets, surveying the room with the air of someone who had nothing left to lose. "Well," he said finally, his voice low and deceptively calm, "I guess congratulations are in order. You won." Julian's jaw tightened. "It's over, Daniel. Whatever you're here for, it won't change anything." Daniel chuckled softly, shaking his head. "You think it's that simple? You think because you've exposed me, I'm just going to fade away?" His eyes flicked to Beth, and for a moment, she saw the fury simmering just beneath the surface. "You have no idea what you've done." Beth swallowed hard, refusing to look away. "What I've done is stop you from hurting anyone else." Daniel's smile twisted into something darker, more dangerous. "You think this ends with me? You think the people I've worked with, the people I've protected, are going to let this stand? I wasn't the only one pulling strings. There are others, people with more power than you can imagine, and they won't let you walk away from this. Beth's heart pounded in her chest. Julian stepped forward, his voice hard. "You're bluffing." Daniel's eyes gleamed with cold amusement. "Am I? You've made enemies, Julian. Powerful enemies. And they're not as forgiving as I am." Beth felt the floor tilt beneath her. She had always known Daniel was dangerous, but this was something far worse. This wasn't just about Daniel anymore. He had opened a door, and now, she and Julian were standing in the crosshairs of something much larger. "I came here to warn you," Daniel said quietly. "You've won this round, but it's not over. It's never over." With that, he turned and walked out of the room, leaving a heavy silence in his wake. Beth stood frozen, her mind racing, the weight of his words pressing down on her like a vice. Julian's voice broke the silence. "We'll deal with it." Beth turned to him, her heart still pounding. What if he's right? What if there's more to this than we realized? Julian met her gaze, his expression resolute. "Then we'll keep fighting. We've come too far to back down now." Beth nodded, though the fear still gnawed at her. They had exposed Daniel, but at what cost? The battle wasn't over. It had only just begun. But for the first time in years, Beth felt a sense of clarity, of purpose. She wasn't running anymore. She wasn't hiding. She had faced Daniel Blake and won. And no matter what came next, she knew she was ready for it. Outside the office window, the storm had finally passed. The clouds were breaking, revealing the first glimmer of sunlight in days. A new beginning, fragile and uncertain, but a beginning nonetheless. Beth took a deep breath, the weight of the past lifting, even if just for a moment. She didn't know what the future held, but she knew one thing for sure. She wasn't afraid anymore. If you enjoyed this heartwarming story about overcoming challenges and family love, don't forget to like the video, comment on what touched you the most, and subscribe to the channel. Stay tuned for our next exciting story.